Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Today's webinar is going to be History of Native American Housing, presented by Shelley Tucciarelli. I am not Brooke Warrington. My name is Alyssa Atkins, and I am the Training and Development Coordinator for the Native Learning Center, and today I will be your webinar facilitator. A quick disclaimer before we get started: this webinar provides a summary of fundamental concepts, requirements, and/or procedures within the allotted 90 minutes. The material discussed does not illustrate all possible scenarios that could be applicable. Also displayed here is our copyright infringement law. This is just a friendly reminder that the webinar presentation materials are protected by copyright, trademark, trade secret, and other intellectual property laws. Before we get started, I want to familiarize you with the new platform and where things can be found. You can access a copy of today's slides and access today's webinar recording in the future by going to the courses section. The resources items for download and the webinar recordings are available within the online courses when you go through the courses page. Each time you are ready to join one of our webinars moving forward, you will just log into the website and click on the large green banner that will be across the top of the screen, like in the picture. Remember that you only have to register for the online platform once, and then you have access to every webinar instead of having to individually register for each one. When you first join the webinar, called Virtual Class on the New Platform, it will prompt you to complete an audio test before joining. Please select the listen only option so we can avoid any audio feedback during the webinar. We appreciate your assistance with this. If you're needing to change the speaker your audio is playing from, you can select the phone icon, and this will bring up a list of your speaker and mic devices so you can choose your preferred audio output. Even though you will be muted, we do still want to encourage your participation during today's webinar, and there are a couple of tools you can use. Please note that if you're not muted, you can mute your mic by clicking on the blue microphone icon at the bottom of the screen. In the left-hand gray menu panel, you will see the public chat, the shared notes, and the users list. If you click on the shared notes, you will find a link for today's webinar feedback survey, a link to join our weekly email newsletter so you can always know when our webinars and various trainings are happening, a link to the new location of our Cathedra webinars archive on our YouTube channel, a link to connect us with, a link to connect with us on LinkedIn, and a link to bookmark for easy login to Cathedra Constant Learning in the future. If you click on the public chat, you will see a chat open between all webinar attendees, the NLC facilitator, and your webinar instructor. Simply click the box that says send messages to the public chat, type the message you want to send, and hit enter, or click on the blue paper airplane icon to send your message in. Please send your comments and any questions you have in the chat, and feel free to use the raise hand feature in the bottom right corner of the screen if you think we have missed something along the way. Any tech support issues can be submitted here as well, and I will do my best to help you navigate through it. Let's all get the chat box going together now by letting us know your name, where you're joining us from, your tribal affiliation, and your work or role in Indian country. Okay, I am now happy to pass over the presentation to Shelley.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. Appreciate it. Hello, everyone. Let's open with a prayer today. I want to thank the Creator for bringing us together. Everyone in this training, all our executive directors, board members, and staff of our tribal housing programs are our true heroes. They are our essential workers all the time. We thank them for all the good work they do. Please help us work together to keep our community strong. Let us not dwell on the negative, but highlight our successes. In Jesus' name, amen. I would like to start out by thanking the Native Learning Center for providing these training opportunities for Indian country and for providing me the opportunity to be the instructor. I've been working with the Native Learning Center for many years, and they are doing amazing trainings. Georgette also has an amazing staff that she's working with. So glad to be working with the Native Learning Center. Let me start out by introducing myself. I am Shelley Tuzzarelli, and I'm a proud member of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin. My reservation is up near Green Bay. I have been in affordable housing for over 30 years, and it is truly a passion of mine. I am the owner of Turtle Clan Development Services. It is a Native American woman-owned small business I started in 2013. The mission of my company is through training and technical assistance like these trainings to help tribal members and leaders to increase the quality and quantity of affordable housing and to develop or expand economic development in their communities in Indian country nationwide. I am also the co-founder and executive director of Visionary Ventures NFP Corporation. Our nonprofit is a Native American nonprofit 501c3 with an over 51% Native American board of directors and an advisory board with 100% Native American members. Our mission is to work with community members to advocate and promote affordable housing, economic development, and services to the Native American communities. In providing these opportunities, it helps to bring stability and hope to individuals and families. Previous to starting my own company, I worked for over 20 years with Illinois Housing Development Authority. They are the agency that finances affordable housing for the entire state. I worked in the low-income housing tax credit department and actually managed the program for a couple of years. It's always great doing these trainings with Indian housing authorities. The position of the executive director and their amazing staff are such important positions. They help to make our tribal members getting into decent quality housing, which we all know helps to stabilize families. These jobs can sometimes be a thankless position. I want to take the time now to thank all of you for doing such a great job that you are doing. You know, after we all lived through COVID, when we all had to quarantine at home, we realized how important it is to have a stable home environment. It is great to hear about all the new housing developments going up in Indian country. We actually have the first low-income housing tax credit development under construction on my reservation in Oneida. So I'm very excited. Been hoping for this for years. We all know that we are in a housing crisis and that there is such a housing shortage in Indian country. Also in urban areas with large Native American populations. I just want to say that you are all making a huge impact on families when you help them get into housing. We have to keep working on developing additional housing and programs for our tribal members on and off the reservation. Oops, there I am. The objectives of the training today is, as we know, the United States has a trust responsibility to Native American tribes and specifically to the people. This trust responsibility is based on sacred treaties with Indian tribes, federal statutes, court decisions, executive agreements, and through the course of other transactions and federal policies from the early 1800s. In order to understand where we are today in our Indian housing, we need to understand what course of actions took place to get us here. After this webinar, you will understand the history of Indian housing. That will include what is the 1937 Housing Act, when Indian housing authorities became established, when the Office of Native American Programs was established, and what are the NAHASDA objectives. As Wista mentioned, everyone will be muted, and please use the chat box, for those questions that she asked. And just wanted to let everybody know that the PowerPoint presentation is available to download, and Wista will let you know at the end of this how to do that. Let's go on to the next one. As I mentioned, the United States has a trust responsibility to Native American tribes and to our people. This trust responsibility extends to the areas of healthcare, education, natural resources, public safety, and of course, housing. I have been in affordable housing industry for over 30 years, and housing is so important for the stability of our families. To understand where we are today, we have to take a look at and understand the course of actions that took place to get us to this point. Your current housing program is governed by the Native Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act of 1996. But prior to NAHASDA, Indian housing was governed by the 1937 Housing Act. After the Great Depression, federal programs were created in an effort to help America's poorest citizens. The United States Housing Act of 1937, one of the many post-Depression New Deal programs, promised to provide safe and sanitary dwellings for America's poor. The 1937 Housing Act authorized local governments to organize public housing agencies and provided loan funds to these agencies for low-income housing projects. It also permitted the federal government to guarantee these loans and to make yearly payments. Although the 1937 Act provided for the creation of public housing programs, Indian housing programs did not begin until the mid-1960s. In order to apply for funding, tribes were required to establish an Indian Housing Authority. This was accomplished by the Tribal Council passing a housing ordinance. Indian housing authorities were governed by a board of commissioners whose members were elected or appointed by the tribe. An executive director is hired by the board of commissioners and or the tribal council to run the day-to-day operations of the housing authority. The 1937 Act provided funds on a competitive basis for the construction of low-rent units or mutual help homes. There were also programs for rehabilitation of these units while they were under the management of the housing authority. Rehabilitation programs were the Comprehensive Improvement Assistance Program, the CIAP, and also the Comprehensive Grant Program, which is also referred to as COMP grant. In 1949, Congress passed another bill that updated the 37 Act and it addressed the post-World War II housing shortage. The bill renewed the federal commitment to provide safe and sanitary homes to the poor and expanded it to include a decent home and suitable living environment for all American families. Unfortunately, all American families did not include families in Indian country. The housing needs in Indian country were not included in the 1937 Housing Act. This was probably due to the federal government termination policy towards Indian tribes in the late 1940s and 1950s. The termination was a process designed to dissolve the federal government-to-government relations with tribes and assimilate Indian people into mainstream America. Tribes at this time lacked the experience and influence in government and policies to assert their housing rights under existing federal and state law during this time. Most tribes also lacked the financial capability to finance their own housing programs. This is the time that a lot of Native Americans moved to urban areas with a promise of jobs, housing, and services. When they got there, of course, we know there were no jobs. Well, there were some jobs, but there was no housing or services. And that's why in most of these large urban populations like Chicago, Phoenix, San Francisco, that's why their American Indian centers were established to help a lot of the tribal members that came to the urban areas, to help them find the jobs, help them find housing, and also, provide that connection to other tribal members in the urban areas. Many went back to the reservations, but many did stay. In 1960, John F. Kennedy visited the Pine Ridge Reservation during his campaign for president of the United States. After seeing horrible housing conditions, he vowed to bring federal assistance to Native Americans if he was elected. In 1961, after being elected, President Kennedy convened his cabinet and asked how they could help provide federal assistance to tribes for housing. It was not until 1961 that Indian tribes became eligible for housing assistance under federal programs, assistance that the rest of the United States had access to for the past 25 years. Still, in 1961, there are two major events that forever changed Indian housing. The first change was that the Public Housing Administration, HUD's predecessor agency, recognized tribal governments as local governing bodies that could establish Indian housing authorities under tribal law by approving a tribal ordinance. This meant that tribal members on reservations and trust lands became formally eligible through the Indian housing authorities for publicly assisted housing programs, which again, the rest of the country had been accessing for the past 25 years. With this rule, the first Indian housing authority was established when the Oglawa Sioux tribe on the Pine Reservation in South Dakota created an Indian housing authority under tribal law in August of 1961. The second change is that the Public Housing Administration also determined that states could establish Indian housing authorities in cases where tribal government was not federally recognized, but exercised the necessary administrative powers. And also states were required to pass a law that authorized the establishment of an Indian housing authority. This opened the program to non-reservation federally recognized tribes, Alaskan Native villages, and a limited number of state-recognized tribes. So all of this, these programs are now opening up this housing opportunities for our tribal communities throughout the United States and Alaska. By the end of 1962, the Pine Ridge Demonstration Project helped convince the Public Housing Administration Legal Counsel that more than low rent projects were needed, since 85% of the tribal families needing homes earned $2,000 or less per year. The Public Housing Administration's legal counsel had concluded that the 37 Housing Acts contained the legal authority to create self-help programs. The self-help or mutual help concept was based on the idea that the home buyer would contribute one of the following: land, materials, or labor, which we all call as sweat equity, towards the purchase of their home. These contributions would give more low-income tribal families the chance to own single-family homes, often at lower payments than the low-rent program. Also, it was believed that the pride of ownership would be inspired and there would be more incentive to maintain the home and property. The Public Housing Administration announced the first mutual help housing program in December of 1962. The first mutual help program was inaugurated in Indian Country by the San Carlos Apache Indian Housing Authority in 1964. Indian homes were developed under this program. It's now known as the Old Mutual Help Program until 1976. As we all know, that problems which occurred from the onset of these first initiatives still plague tribal housing programs and their federal funding agencies today. The Public Housing Authority modeled both the low rent and the mutual help delivery systems after its urban multifamily prototype. Unfortunately, this approach had a long list of unforeseen consequences for Indian housing. Some of these consequences included Indian preference for single family instead of multifamily dwellings, the complication that arose because of trust status on Indian lands, not knowing or considering the cultural aspects of working in Indian country, Indian housing authorities' lack of training and professional expertise, the rural isolation and location of most reservations. And as we all know, most banks were very reluctant to lend money on trust lands. There was also inefficient federal interagency coordination. As we all know, one department did not know what the other department was doing. So there was just always a mix-up of what was going on. Also, the high cost and significant amount of time it took to develop projects in Indian country. These problems persisted for many years, despite many efforts to address them. Again, like I mentioned earlier, many of these issues still remain today in different ways and are directly affecting the quality of the tribe's housing program. It soon became apparent that the Public Housing Administration and the Bureau of Indian Affairs had to work closely together in order to address these problems. So in 1963, the Public Housing Administration and the Bureau of Indian Affairs signed the first coordination agreement for mutual help projects. This agreement identified each agency's responsibilities in the mutual help development process. The Bureau of Indian Affairs was already developing homes using construction supervisors, so it was just logical that it should provide the construction oversight for mutual help projects. After that, the Bureau of Indian Affairs was designed the lead oversight agency for all development activities. The Public Housing Administration's role was to give technical assistance and help facilitate projects. In 1965, a second coordination agreement was signed between the two agencies, this time to cover Public Housing Administration's low rent projects. Both agencies' responsibilities remained the same under this agreement. Problems began quickly as both agencies were severely criticized for vague and overlapping roles, requiring a complexity of bureaucratic red tape that caused unnecessary and costly construction delays. It also became apparent that the Bureau of Indian Affairs' responsibilities were more than they could handle. In response, there were two major changes that occurred in 1965. The first one in 1965 was the Bureau of Indian Affairs established the Division of Housing Assistance with two programs. Housing Development, which primarily funded staff salaries, and the Housing Improvement Program, which gave grants to rehabilitate homes and for building homes for very low-income families. Also in 1965, Congress passed the Department of Housing and Urban Development Act, creating HUD as a new federal umbrella agency. When HUD was created, there were 6 former federal agencies that were now merged under Housing and Urban Development. And they were the Public of Housing Administration, PHA, the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, Housing and Home Finance, Community Facilities Administration, Urban Renewal Administration, and the Federal National Mortgage Administration. So it was now, all of these organizations are now under one umbrella and have to work together. So again, it's kind of like that coordination that they needed. That coordination between agencies. The first formal reference to HUD's obligation to serve low-income Indian families was in the Housing and Urban Act of 1968, which included the Modernization Program. This was the Comprehensive Improvement Assistance Program, which was referred to CIAP. This modernization program was designed to fund major rehabilitation and repairs to low-income rental units. It was not until 1979, however, that Indian housing authorities became eligible for the Comprehensive Improvement Assistance Program. Again, some of the things that were available to the rest of the country was not available in Indian country. But again, changes were continuing to improve. The promise of the Indian housing programs established in the 1960s was under increasing pressure as the 1970s began. Federal programs administered by HUD were more fitted to an urban environment, which made the development of effective housing programs even more difficult in Indian country. There was considerable national interest in addressing the recognized housing need. However, there was the logistical challenges of developing housing in Indian country. There were overwhelming construction delays that were compounded by new projects from multiple programs and funding agencies going into production without adequate delivery systems, controls, and virtually untrained local Indian Housing Authority staff. HUD issued various rules and regulations that continued a long history of federally established guidelines intended to better monitor and measure the effectiveness of Indian housing programs. But again, the guidelines and HUD-directed housing programs did not work. Because of all these continued issues, HUD and the Bureau of Indian Affairs quickly realized that the goal of eliminating substandard Indian housing conditions would not be completed by their goal of 1974. In 1971, the Government Accounting Office, the GAO, issued a congressional report on Indian housing that recommended a national Indian housing policy to stimulate agency coordination and to accelerate the completion of projects. In March of 1976, HUD published the Interim Indian Housing Handbook. The handbook contained the regulations, their guidelines, and procedures. The new regulations made it easier for the centralized oversight of the Indian programs and clarified federal agency roles. They also created a measuring device for monitoring the effectiveness of Indian Housing Authority management, particularly in rent and homebuyer payment collections. Tenant accounts receivable, or TARs, became an industry buzzword as collection became directly tied to the Indian Housing Authority management subsidy funds. In the regulations, the mutual help program became Old Mutual Help, superseded by the new Mutual Help program. The new Mutual Help program had, among other things, fixed unit prices and fixed amortization schedules. In 1978, the General Accounting Office issued a report on Indian housing that found that 86,500 tribal families lived in substandard housing or needed new housing as compared to 63,000 documented in its 1971 application. Housing construction starts had dropped dramatically, and many of the long-standing problems still had not been addressed. Obviously, the federally directed program delivery system had failed. The failure of the top-down administration was made even worse because local Indian housing authorities received no training in housing development and administration. The National American Indian Housing Council was established in 1974, and they reasoned with HUD and Congress that the goal of eliminating substandard housing conditions would not occur with Indian housing programs that were federally directed, and that training and other capacity building efforts should be tribal specific. It would take 22 years until tribally directed housing would be authorized by law. Oh, sorry, I forgot this. Was the next one from the last one. So again, it was the National American Indian Housing Council that when they were established, that's really when things started to take action. So we really have to recognize the great work that they've done. The 1980s was truly a decade of survival for tribal housing funding. Indian housing conditions worsened, and the presidential budget request during this time proposed no funding for Indian housing programs. Throughout the decade, Congress allowed only limited resources that would create an average of 2,300 new units during the 80s, about half of the funding from previous years. In the rental program, low-income families typically are month-to-month leases. Some programs would require a year lease. Most rental programs include 2 or 3 primary types of structures, such as a single-family detached units and duplexes or triplexes. Elderly and handicapped projects may include congregate housing with common dining and other facilities. The homes are rented to low-income families, and HUD subsidized their rental payments with payments to the Indian Housing Authority in the form of an operating subsidy. HUD provided this assistance for a 40-year period. At the end of 40 years, the project's development costs were retired through provisions of the annual contributions contract. This was considered the financing contract. Tenants paid according to their income, which means that if a tenant's income decreased, their rent also decreased. And there were no minimum. The rent also increased if the tenant's income increased. The Indian Housing Authority was responsible for the maintenance and repair for damage that was not caused by the tenants. The mutual help homeownership. This program was for low-income tribal families to own their homes rather than to rent. Before construction began, the mutual help homebuyers entered into a mutual help and occupancy agreement with the Indian Housing Authority. Among the terms and conditions, the family agreed to contribute at least $1,500 to the project before moving in. The mutual help contributions included at least one of the following: cash, labor, land where the home will be located, and or materials and equipment. That could include appliances for the home. The mutual help occupancy agreement specifies the type and the amount of the contribution. Credit was given to the home buyer for the contribution when the initial purchase price of the home was determined. HUD gave financial assistance to the Indian Housing Authority for the cost of the project. The government helps the home buyer pay off the purchase price annually through the annual contributions contract. Mutual help home buyers were also responsible for paying their own utilities and for maintaining the home. In addition, they paid the Indian Housing Authority a monthly administrative charge. As income permitted, they also made additional monthly payments toward the purchase of the home. The Section 8 Leased Housing Assistance Payments Program gave assistance to low-income families who lived in Section 8 housing or preferred to find housing in the private housing market. HUD provided a subsidy to help meet the costs for operating the program, and the Indian Housing Authority paid that portion of the rent that the tenant is unable to pay because their income was too low. Section 8 was and still is widely used in public housing, but was not widely used by tribes before the passing of the Native American Indian Housing Assistance Act, NAHASDA, of 1996. So again, Section 8 was around, but was not being able to be used in Indian country until the NAHASDA was passed. By the end of 1980, mutual help homes comprised about 61% of Indian Housing Authority's housing. HUD reported in 1981 that over 30% of all Indian Housing Authorities were troubled and unable to meet financial obligations. Some of the reasons for this was that Indian Housing Authority's failure to collect their tenant accounts receivable. They had over-budgeted expenditures. There was a lack of coordination and cooperation between the Indian Housing Authority and tribes the state and regional agencies. There was also a lack of good management resources, tribal government instability, and poor tribal economies at the time. In 1984, HUD established an Office of Indian Housing that separated Indian housing programs from public housing programs for the first time. Indian housing was legislatively separated from public housing when Congress passed the Indian Housing Act of 1988. The act created a separate Title II of the U.S. Housing Act of 1937 that was directly and specifically applicable to Indian housing. HUD's Office of Native American Programs, ONAP as we all refer to it, it currently operates and was created by Section 902 of the Housing and Community Development Act of 1992. On October 1st, 1993, the HUD Office of Indian Housing Programs and HUD headquarters in Washington, D.C., and the regional offices of Indian housing or Indian programs became officially the Office of Native American Programs. So now we have one program that has all of our programs under it. So again, this change improved uniformity between regions and provided Indian housing authorities with direct assistance from HUD's central offices, in addition to assistance provided through the regional ONAP offices. So I know a lot of our, there are different regions of ONAP. So a lot of our housing authorities on the reservations, the Indian housing authorities, can now reach out if they have questions on any of their programs, can reach out directly to their regional ONAP officer. And there's a lot of people that have that number directly. So they're making sure that if you have any questions or anything, make sure that you are in contact with your regional ONAP office. Know who your contact person is and reach out to them periodically just to let them know what's going on with your office and some of your programs that you're doing. Because again, we're very thankful that we have this opportunity to have our own regional offices that we can reach out to. Again, things are finally starting to move in the right direction. So today we have NAHASDA, and NAHASDA was enacted in 1996. It changed everything. One change brought about by NAHASDA is that funding is allocated to tribes rather than housing authorities. Since funding is allocated to tribes, they have the option of administering the programs themselves or naming a tribally designated housing entity, a TDHE, to be the recipient of the grant and to administer the program. The tribally designated housing entity is designated by a resolution of the tribe or the tribe's governing body. The TDHEs are most often Indian housing authorities that were operating programs prior to the enactment of NAHASDA. The housing authority has an executive director that runs the day-to-day operations for the programs, and the oversight body for a housing authority that is the TDHE is still the Board of Commissioners. An extraordinary amount of thought and work went into the passage of NAHASDA. There were tribes, Indian housing authorities and the National American Indian Housing Council that work closely and were closely involved with the representatives and from congressional and administrative staff to craft this legislation that would address the long would craft this legislation that would address the long neglected housing needs in tribal communities. NAHASDA is a definite departure from the top-down process of previous Indian housing rules and regulations. NAHASDA recognizes the right of Indian self-determination and tribal self-governance by making assistance available directly to Indian tribes or to the tribally designated housing entities. Self-determination was and continues to be the hallmark of NAHASDA. In the chat box, if you know, do you know who administers your NAHASDA funds? Is it the tribe or is it the tribally designated housing entity? If you know, put it in the chat box. If you don't know, that might be a good question to go back and ask, because again, it was an option that the tribe could manage it, or there was a tribally designated housing entity. Again, some tribes today, they have chosen to abolish their housing authority and operate their housing as a tribal housing department. However, this is not always possible in areas where the housing authorities were established under the state law. When housing is administered by the tribe, the oversight body may be the tribal council, it may be a business committee, a housing committee, or some other group that the tribe may choose. But regardless of who is administering your program, the tribe is the beneficiary of the Indian Housing Block Grant and is ultimately responsible for the success of the program. I know that I'm giving a lot of information here. There's a lot of dates and programs. So I think what I'll do also is I will send it to OISTA, my talking points, so that you have all this information available. So we'll make that I send her and she can email it to everyone that's on today. But it's a lot of information. But when I first started doing my research on this and finding out how we got to where we are today, I was just fascinated to see that there was a lot of programs that started way before NAHASDA, and and now we're all working in NAHASDA, and that's all we know. But there is this background that we all should know to understand how we got here today. So I will make sure to get that information to OISTA. The NAHASDA objectives are to assist and promote affordable housing activities that develop, maintain, and operate affordable housing occupancy by low-income Native American families, to ensure better access to private mortgage markets for tribes and individual tribal members, the coordination activities to provide housing with economic and community development, such as, providing, nursing homes, community centers, youth centers, also our Indian health services, also plans for and integrate infrastructure resources with housing development. We all know how important and expensive it is to get the sewers, the water, and electricity to new housing developments. A lot of our reservations, we have a lot of land, but a lot of times that land is far away from our infrastructure, the water, the sewers, and everything. So trying to get access and get those infrastructure to do a housing development can be very expensive. So again, finding those resources is very important. Also, another objective is to promote the development of private capital markets in Indian country. I know we all still struggle with this, but it is getting better. There's a lot more companies that are doing work in Indian country and understanding how to work with tribal nations. We all need to be using the low-income housing tax credits, the new market tax credits, all of the energy grants that are out there right now, and other federal, state, and local funds to make our projects feasible. Everyone else around the country are accessing these funds, and we need to be accessing them also in order to be providing these housing developments and also our community economic developments in our communities. So there's a lot of funding out there. If you need consultants to work with you to get these projects doing, there's a lot of good consultants working in Indian country also. So I highly suggest looking into all of these different funding sources. Again, we are in a housing crisis. We've been in a housing crisis in Indian country since the beginning, but now it's across the nation. These are the NAHASDA requirements. The 1937 Act units must be operated and maintained. Policy should cover eligibility, admissions, and occupancy. You should have a tenant and home buyer selection policy, and it should include waiting list policies and notification of rejection. There should be a policy for rents and home buyer payments, and it should include information about collections. Insurance is required on all owned, operated, and assisted units. Should maintain management policies that include personnel, grievances, disposition, and any other policies that you feel are necessary. There should be a proper management and maintenance of the housing units. So some of the key points of NAHASDA are HUD monitors the program to ensure compliance. And we all know HUD will step in for issues of non-compliance. With the HUD Secretary's approval, the tribe can use a federal guarantee to undertake affordable housing activities as long as it does not exceed 5 times the amount of the tribe's block grant. It reauthorized the HUD 184 American Indian Home Ownership Loan Guarantee Program. This really is a great program, and we should be all helping our tribal members access this program. I actually purchased my condo several years ago in Chicago with the HUD 184. Most states you can use the HUD 184 in most states, but in Illinois, because we don't have a federally recognized tribe at the time, a tribal nation here in Illinois at the time, the Ho-Chunk, because they had so many, and they're out of Wisconsin, they had so many tribal members that lived in Illinois, they actually put in that their footprint included 5 counties in Illinois. And it's like the top 5 counties, like Cook County, DuPage, Lake County, the ones right over the border from Wisconsin. So thankfully, Ho-Chunk did that in order, but HUD 184 should be accessible to most tribal communities. I also helped my niece work through the process. She lives in Indiana, and again, Indiana has no federally recognized tribes, but the Potawatomi had lands for years, centuries in Indiana, so they put as their footprint the entire state of Indiana, which I wish Ho Chunk would have done. But so she was able to purchase her home through the HUD 184. And again, in Oneida, when I did my home at the time, I worked with First Tribal out of South Dakota, and that's Jewel Burnett's team. But since then, the Oneidas, we were the first tribal nation to establish a native bank on our reservation, Bay Bank. It's in Oneida, and now we have 3 branches. They are working closely with tribal members to use the HUD 184 program. And my goal is to help as many Native Americans purchase homes over the next 5 years as possible. This is how we help our tribal members gain that asset building component like everyone else in the country does. So if we can help our community members first go into affordable housing and then work with them to become homeowners through the HUD 184, I think that's a great goal that we could have for all of our housing departments. Also, one of the other thing that it entails is that it extends the leasehold interest in trust or restricted land to 50 years. And also, you have to make sure that conflict of interest provisions are included. It expands the affordable housing opportunities and specifically address families who are above low income. So we got to help our tribal members that, you know, maybe they're not low income, maybe they're that middle market, to help them become homeowners also and work with them. NAHASDA also has eligible affordable housing activities. These activities that are allowed under NAHASDA include Indian housing assistance, housing development, which is much needed, housing services. I always say you really can't develop affordable housing without providing those services to the residents also. So this is very important. Also, housing management services, crime prevention and safety activities, and model activities. So there's a lot of great things that can be done with your NAHASDA funds. So again, as you're working towards budgeting your next project and your next program, you know, make sure that you're thinking about what you need in your community for the future. I just want to go over briefly the role of the tribal housing and the executive director's roles and function. As tribal housing executive directors, the Board of Commissioners and housing staff, your hard work and efforts create safe and prosperous communities for Native families by expanding homeownership and affordable housing opportunities, empowering residents of Indian housing through the creation of jobs and economic development opportunities, enforcing fair housing opportunities, making Indian housing developments drug-free, and helping to end overcrowding and homelessness. To understand the executive director's role within the housing program, it might be helpful to talk about the program's framework. Who are the responsible parties? You first have the tribe up at the top. Then you have your housing board, your board of commissioners. And then you have your executive director of the housing. You have the managers. And then you have the employees and staff below. The way that the various parts of an organization that are formally arranged is called the organizational structure. This structure can be displayed in the form of an organizational chart, which is a diagram like is shown here. And it shows the organization's division of labor. It shows your reporting relationships and the communication channels. It also shows the functional links between groups and individuals. While your housing program may not be organized in this way, this chart is just typical for many housing programs and provides a basis for discussing how the relationships work. It is very important to have an organizational chart for your program. If you don't have one, make sure to put one together. And as we had discussed on the previous slide, under the managers, you will have your staff and employees under there. I just couldn't get it under there with my diagram. So let's go on to the next organizational structure. Organizational structure really defines the roles and helps determine the division of labor. This term relates to the functional parts of the organization, such as admissions, maintenance, construction, accounting, human resources, and other departments. Your housing program's organizational chart might be more detailed than the previous example and may include formal position and titles, with the manager or director listed directly above the employees in that department. With labor, when labor is divided in this way, we are able to see how certain groups are interrelated with other groups in the organization. In very large tribal entities that deal with several products or services, it is possible that one group of employees would rarely interact with employees from another functional group. This is not likely to occur within your program because all of your activities have one thing in common, and that is housing. So you're always working with your different departments within your housing department. Next thing we want to talk about is reporting relationships. In the organizational chart, we can see kind of a top-down relationship with the tribe being up at the top position. In some cases, that first position might be the tribal leader, maybe the chief, the chairman of the tribe, or the tribal council. In others, it might be the entire membership of the tribe. The second position in the chart is the housing board, the board of commissioners, which in your case, again, may be called the board of commissioners. Since this position is below the tribe, this means that the housing board reports or answers to the party in the first position. Such is the case with each of the housing position. The housing board reports, again, the housing board reports to the first position, and then in the case of the subordinate positions employees would report to managers, and managers would report to the housing director. And then the housing director would report to the board. And again, when we understand all these different reporting relationships, that's when we understand the communication channels, how we would communicate within these different, how we would, we have to understand the communication between. So as the reporting relationship, communication should also flow according to the organizational chart. So for example, the housing authority's executive director should pass instructions down to the manager, and then the manager will pass on that information to their employees. Since the board is near the top, communications should not flow from the board directly to employees. The board should communicate with the executive director, who will then communicate the information to the employees. So again, we need to know how those communication channels should work. It is very important to know that for your housing program to be successful, it is important for the board and the housing director to work together to achieve your common goals. The relationship should be collaborative, cooperative, supportive, and respectful. As tribal housing executive directors, board of commissioners, and housing staff, your hard work and efforts create safe and prosperous communities for Native families. Like I had mentioned earlier, you guys really are our real heroes. You are out there every day working so hard and making a difference. Some days it can feel like a thankless job, but you are appreciated more than you know, and I know you don't hear that enough. But when your tribal members have a decent, safe place to live, and you're making a difference in their lives, well, that's why we do it. We are always thinking about the next project or that next program that will continue to help make a difference. Yes, that's why we do it. I want to thank everyone for taking the time out today of your busy schedules to be in this webinar. But I would also like to see, OISTA, if it's possible, to have any of the, anybody on to talk about any programs or housing developments that they're actually working on right now in their community. Is that possible?
Hi, I think the attendees are able to unmute themselves, or they're able to select once they enter the room. Let me see if they can choose to get off, or if they can choose to put on.
Is anybody would like to just talk about any housing developments that are going on in their community? I would love to hear anything. We've got a little bit of extra time here. I'd like to just hear about some of the great things that's going on in Indian country. Does anybody like to share some thoughts? Well, if not, okay. Melody says that they're building a fourplex for Hopeland Rancheria. And how are you financing that? Is it through tribal funds, or are you working? Because I know that's one of the things that the HUD 184 can do. They can do up to a fourplex. Grant and leveraging tribe funds. Oh, that's wonderful. Yep. Leveraging your tribal funds is a great way to be able to continue to do some of these housing projects. Does anybody else have anything that they're working on in their community?
Yeah, sorry, Shelly. It's when they enter the room is when they select if they want to have audio or not, or if they want to have their mic option or not. So I apologize about that. We'll add it into the instructions if they want to keep their audio on, or their mic on.
Well, I think that's all of the information that I have for today. But again, what I'd like to do is provide my talking points to be able, because there's a lot of information in there and dates and stuff. And one of the things that I recommend for new employees, or for whenever you're putting that book together for your new board members, I think having this training, have them go on to the Native Learning Center and just listen to this training so that they can hear where we came from in our housing. I think it's very beneficial to let them know that, you know, we came from nothing and look where we are today. We're actually building brand new housing. We're building brand new nursing homes. We're doing all this information, all these different projects and programs in our community that we never even had access to in the beginning. So I just think it's wonderful, these types of training, to make sure that you put that information in their packets whenever you're hiring even new employees, to let them understand the history of the Native American housing is, and I think you have a better appreciation of where we are today once you realize where we came from. So I just wanted to thank everyone for taking the time out of your busy schedules today to be in this webinar. I really enjoy this training, and please use this information to continue to train your staff and new board members. Again, put that executive director and board training packages together so that they have all the information that they need to understand all your programs and your projects, because you know, your board members are going to be the ones making the decisions for a lot of the things that you're doing. So make sure that they have all the information that they need to make good decisions at the board meetings. So if there aren't any questions, oh, here's a way. Melody also said, just did 8 homes in Moortown and starting 8 homes in Berry Creek. Oh, wow, that's fantastic. Again, are you doing the same thing, grant monies and leveraging tribal funds? Because that home ownership is just amazing if we can get, and are you, yes, okay, are they for sale or are they rental homes? Low rent homes. Wonderful, wonderful. Do you have for sale housing also? No. Yeah, that's something, you know, once you get those moving, maybe even, because I know through the HUD 184, if the tribal uses those funds, they can own like the homes, and then they can either rent them out or they can sell the homes to tribal members. So I think the HUD 184 is a good way to start from some of the tribal communities to purchase, build homes, and then we do have some lease purchase soon. Oh, that's wonderful. I think that's great. Well, does anyone else have any exciting things that they're doing in their community? If you want to put it in the chat, I can let people know. If not, I think, Owista, I think let's just give everybody back 15 minutes of their day. And Yako, everyone, be well, treat everyone well until we meet again. I really appreciate you coming to this webinar. And again, it's just hard timing. Some of the times it's hard to do the timing on these, because I'm used to having breakout sessions and things like that. But with this one, it was just we weren't able to. So I really appreciate everyone, and have a wonderful day. Thank you. And please fill out the feedback forms. It really helps us to understand, you know, what more trainings and things like that that we need in the future. So I really appreciate it. And here's my contact information. Please, if you're working on a project, again, I've been in affordable housing for over 30 years and work in Indian country doing some consulting. I'm working in urban settings. I'm actually working on the first urban Native American housing development in Chicago's history. And so really, and I'm also starting to work on a project in Wisconsin near Milwaukee. So if you're doing projects and have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. And if I don't have an answer, I know somebody who does. So please keep my information handy. And also, if you need somebody I know when you're doing the CDBG, the competitive grants, if you need somebody to bid on a consulting on a project, please reach out to me, because I know sometimes you need at least 2 or 3. I'm willing to look at it and submit a proposal for you. So, and please give me a call if you have any questions regarding that. So thanks, everyone, and hope to see you at some of the National American Indian Housing Council events, some of the Native Learning events, and thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Shelley. You did an incredible job. We greatly appreciate you. And I want to thank all of our attendees for joining us today. As Shelley mentioned, we do have the feedback form up. I did put it in the chat, and it's right here as well if you want to click on it. This feedback helps Shelly tremendously. It lets her know what you enjoyed the most about today's webinar and what you would like to learn in the future. So please let her know what you think. Our next webinar is Emergency Management, Mitigating Hazards, Preparing for and Responding to Emergencies and Recovering Strategies, Part 3. Don't forget to register. You're actually already registered for it. Don't forget to join us on October 22nd for the webinar. You can access this webinar recording and all of our other webinar recordings at our new Cathedra Webinars archive, now posted on our YouTube channel. Feel free to view them and share them with your colleagues and friends. And please check out our upcoming events posted on our various social media sites on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter. We also have a podcast called Hope a Thing, a Native American Podcast, and you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and YouTube, and as well as Simplecast. Once again, thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you, Shelly. We greatly appreciate you, and I hope everybody has a wonderful day.
Thank you. Have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.